The city woke with a hollow, a tremor at the teeth of its bones. It's not that the dawn failed, it's that dawn arrived through a seam, a slit between two clocks where minutes bled into one another and then bled back out. The streetlights hummed with a tired neon blue, the sky a bruised violet that wasn't quite night and not yet day. People moved through that seam as if stepping through a door that refused to stay open. A man crossing a crosswalk, his shoes catching on a thread of time, his face suddenly missing the last 10 seconds and reappearing, as if he had forgotten where he'd been while his feet remembered where to go. I watched it all from the window of the East Arcade, where the glass keeps the cold from meeting the warmth of a soul. The building is a fossil of old engineering, a ruin turned into a hive of servers and wires, and I'm the patchman who keeps the wrong time from crashing into the right one. My name is Iris Cade, and I'm a reality glitch survivor, someone who learned to live with the way the city breathes in and out. The way memory slides from one layer to another without apology. Often I tell people I fix the edges where time leaks through. They nod as if I'm describing something ordinary, a routine maintenance on a machine they pretend to understand. They don't know. They can't know the texture of a day that forgets itself, the way a sidewalk crack can swallow a person for a breath, or how a mother can kiss a child goodbye and then kiss him again, this time with a kiss that is not quite the same. Morning started with the ordinary radiance of a morning in a city that doesn't sleep, except it does sleep in halves. The high line above the river, our main artery of transport, was a ribbon of phosphor, each rail a different timestamp. People rode it with the patience of people who have learned to ride the ends of knives and not bleed. The city's clockwork is delicate, almost tender in its hunger. I was in the nerve bank, the place we call the nerve center for neural bridging, where administrators wear headsets as if they are halos and patch wires the way a surgeon patches a heart. Our team has spent years patching the seams where time leaks, weaving a bridge of consciousness that allows a person to retain a self while a city flinches between moments. We bind memory fragments so that a person doesn't wake to find their own life stitched together by someone else's recollections, or to discover that the friend they believe to be real has drifted into a dream of yesterday. My job is to patch those threads cleanly, to keep the city's identity intact even as it slides. The morning was quiet enough to hear the city breathe. I wore a jacket with a lining of conductive mesh, the kind of garment that hums faintly when you sweat or when the city wants to whisper to you. The monitors on my desk flickered with lines of code that looked like rain across a pane of glass, tiny rain that carried the scent of burnt ozone and old electronics. The status screens showed a dozen time patches in progress, all tiny, almost invisible, but each one an act of faith that the present could be saved from dissolving into something unrecognizable. Then, something unscheduled happened, a ripple ordinary to those who live inside this glitchy world, but terrifying to those who keep the city standing. A pedestrian didn't simply vanish down a street. They melted into a phantasm, reappeared a block away with yesterday's smile, a smile that wasn't quite theirs, but looked perfectly familiar. The city's pattern, our pattern, was disrupted, as if someone had pressed the pause button for a blink too long, and then released it with a snap. The man who glided out of the seam was not a stranger at all. He wore the jacket of a man I know by name. A laborer who fixes streetlights. I had shared a coffee with him once, 2 months ago, near the transit hub. He looked at me with the same eyes I'd seen 1,000 times, tired, wary, a little bit hopeful. But his lips telegraphed something else, a fear he hadn't possessed a breath earlier, the fear of becoming someone else's memory. The small, almost invisible tremor in the city's rhythm grew louder as more people began to slip. A woman at a bus stop blinked, and when she opened her eyes again, her face bore yesterday's sequin glint in its corners. She glowed with a shimmer that wasn't hers, as if a memory had decided to inhabit her skin. It wasn't that she remembered her own day. It was that the city's day remembered her back, like a chorus of echoing voices that suddenly learned to harmonize. I called out to a technician beside me, a quiet man named Soren, who wore a visor fogged with decades of patching. Keep the bridging stable, I said, my voice a steadier rhythm than the tremor that gnawed at the edges of the building. If we lose the link between this time layer and the next, we're going to lose more than a few faces. We'll lose the sense of who they are. Soren nodded, his hands already on the neural tap array, fingers moving with a practiced ease that came from years of working in a tense clockwork world. He didn't ask questions. He listened to the city's pulse and kept pace. The city's pulse has a language you learn to translate. It speaks in glimpses and whispers, and sometimes in the soft tearing of memory from its moorings. The patching crew has learned to read its breaths the way a sailor reads the wind, by the color of the waves. When the city flinches, you don't fix everything, you hold the line. You stabilize enough to keep a person's story from slipping away entirely. That morning, the glitches came in waves. First the vanishing, then the reappearance with something like joy, an aftertaste of something long cherished. Then the smiles, a cascade of yesterday's happiness, washing over the crowd in the plaza like a film that wouldn't peel off. People gathered, uncertain, their voices lowered to a hush that sounded like a held breath, then erupted into a chorus of memory. Some remembered the past with longing, others with a strange, lucid clarity. The first casualty of the day's instability was not a person, but a perception, the sense that the city is a line, a straight wire. It is not. It is a mosaic, a palimpsest of possible times layered upon times. We patch to keep those layers from peeling away, to keep the mosaic from becoming a blur of identical faces and lost names. The Council of Sovereigns visited the Nerve Bank that afternoon, a delegation of 3 dressed in robes of light that shifted like heat on a desert road. In any other city, a visit from a council would be a ceremonial affair, a way to announce policy and reassure the people. Here, the council is both guardian and priest, the body that interprets the city's memory as if it were a scripture. And the memory here is not something to be owned, it's something to be shared, though sometimes in the wrong hands it becomes something to steal. The lead of the group spoke in measured cadence, a voice that seemed to translate into 1,000 microvibrations inside your skull in the most disarming way. They proposed something they called the Harvest Protocol, a consciousness transfer process that would crystallize memory and essence from those who suffer identity crises, those who feel themselves dissolving into the city's many timesheets, and store them into memory crystals, from which a person could be reconstituted with a stable sense of self. The reasoning was cold, practical, and surprisingly almost gentle. If your sense of who you are is scattered across 1,000 slices of time, the cure is to reclaim a single core memory, an anchor, and then rebind the rest around that anchor. An anchor is a good word for it, the steward of the sovereign said, leaning forward with a glimmer in her eye that did not come from a lamp. We offer a ship across the sea of time. Your consciousness will be crystallized, your identity preserved in a structure that time cannot erode. The city will draw a new map of you, one less fragile, more coherent. You won't forget who you are. You won't drift into 1,000 versions of yourself. You will become a precise, single self again. The room hummed with 1,000 small sounds, the clicking of the air vents, the soft sigh of a server warming, the faint static of a device trying to hold back a memory from slipping into the air like glitter. It sounded almost noble. It sounded like salvation. But I have learned to listen for the other half of a sentence. The part the city doesn't tell you unless you watch it and learn to listen to the tremor in the air. The other half was not rhetoric about saving a person from the city's time. It was about the city's power over the self in general. The memory crystals would be a map, yes, but a map that could be rewritten by whoever held the crystallized mind in their palm. The crystal could be walked through by a hand with a different dream, a hand that could reshape a person's memory. The Harvest Protocol carried with it the possibility of a social memory being rearranged, of personal pain being redistributed as a national, curated version of reality. We are not asking for your consent so much as your future. The same steward added, a touch of gravity in her voice that suggested even a single no would upset the delicate machinery of the city's fate. You are not alone, citizen. You are not a solitary thread. The time lattice is a web, and we wish to prune the parts that cause decay, to reinforce those that keep us human. The council then outlined their terms. Those who accepted the transfer would be guaranteed a place within the city's new, stabilized social memory. Those who refused would be protected, but their identities would be put at risk as the city continues to leak and flicker. The memory of those who decline might drift, lose coherence within the urban mind, or clash with others who choose to participate. The risk of erasing others was explicit, a line drawn in ink that could bleed if the page were folded too hard. I asked a question I already understood the answer to. If you crystallize memory, what happens to the person, the original self who carried those memories? Do they vanish, or do they endure somewhere else, waiting to be recalled? The steward of the sovereigns looked at me with a smile that did not reach his eyes, a practiced scythe of politeness. Consciousness merges with a larger continuum. The question is not whether you exist, but which version of you is safe to keep when time agitates the city. The crystal is a preservation device, not an erasure. The identity you fear losing is often the one the city has already outgrown. I did not buy the reassurance. No, not that day. Instead, I watched the room, those who stood ready to be crystallized, those who looked away from the invitation, those for whom the idea of shedding a self had the ring of a funeral bell. The memory crystals on the table shimmered with a soft, cold light, each like a small star trapped in glass, containing a mind's echo of something that could have been. The council's arrival unsettled more than the nerves of patchers like me. It unsettled the city's own sense of self as a shared story with many authors and many editors. If memory crystallization happened citywide, then the city would become a manuscript that any one faction could rewrite at will. The Keepers of Continuum, the rival reality engineering faction I would grow to know as the Shadowline, stood just beyond the veil of the sovereigns, listening, biding. They do not advertise themselves as Dylans. They are the caretakers of the city's temporal boundaries, the ones who believe time is not a fabric to be patched, but a force to be contained. The keepers watched with quiet, almost amused detachment as the sovereigns pressed their case, as the council's voice stirred up a deeper, older fear in the room. The fear that if a city's memory is curated into a crystal, nothing remains private in that city any longer. The fear that memory belongs to a person in this moment, but can be weaponized by another in the next. After the delegation left, the city settled into a heavy hush. The news, not merely the local gossip, but the formal broadcasts that carry through every door and window, made it clear that a decision would come soon. The city would choose either to embrace a shared self, or to maintain a stubborn individuality that might erode away at the edges as the time leaks continued to gnaw at the seams. That night, I walked the spires of the East Arcade's rooftop, feeling the wrongness in the air like static that never quite resolves. The city's horizon blurred, the skyline bending toward something that wasn't there, a distant future always nearly within reach, yet never quite arriving. The memory crystal option seemed both miraculous and terrifying. In one version of events, it offered safety and continuity, a dignified way to preserve who we are when the world around us grows too unstable to bear us. In another, it offered nothing less than a quiet extinction of the self, a dissolution so total that what remained would no longer be human. The city's clock, a towering contraption in the square, ticked in a dozen different cadences. It was as if each district kept its own time, and the clock had become a map of the city's many moods. I touched the cool metal of a railing and watched the river below glow with the reflection of a pink moon that should not have been there. The river, too, seemed to smile with yesterday's joy and cry with today's pain. The city mediated in patterns and symbols. It was a living memory machine, and we, the patchers, the keepers, the citizens, were its custodians and its prisoners. The next day brought a new parcel of data, a citywide glitch spike that threatened to fracture more of the time lattice than a handful of individuals. The keepers' agents had begun to push back, not overtly, but through subtle manipulations, small changes in the patch maps that could cause a cascade of misalignment. We started to see a pattern, a sudden, almost choreographed sequence of vanished faces, then reappearances with more pronounced yesterday's smiles. Perhaps a trial, a demonstration, or a warning. Someone in the Keepers had discovered a way to exploit the bridging patches to nudge the city toward a different, more controllable version of history. I found myself in the main server hall with Soren again, listening to the air vibrate with the collective memory of a city that refuses to stay quiet about who it is. The monitors displayed a grid of maps, tiny lattice nodes across the metropolis, each node pulsing in a rhythm that resembled a heartbeat. The Keepers had engineered a stealth project, a worm in the patching code that could widen the gaps between the time layers just enough to cause a shared memory event, a citywide illusion that would align the beliefs of all citizens to a single, manipulable narrative. The idea was chilling, to weaponize belief itself, turning diversity of memory into uniformity of thought. The revelation did not come from a dramatic confession or a dramatic chase through a time slip. It came as a whispered line from the courier who brought a half-burnt data crystal, a fragment of a memory that did not belong to him. A memory described a meeting between a Keeper's lieutenant and a sovereign steward in a time-warp chamber, where the city's heartbeat sounded loud enough to drown out all other sounds. In that memory, the lieutenant had argued for a different focus, not an entire city-wide crystallization, but a targeted, surgical reweaving of beliefs in select populations, leaders, influencers, gatekeepers, so that the city would respond in predictable ways to the Keepers. The idea of such targeted rewriting shook me to the core. If a faction could phrase the manipulation as cultural healing, a cure for an identity crisis that may be more of a system error than a personal fault, how long would it be before the city accepted the new narrative as the truth? How long before the truth was something created by a few hands that claimed to know what is best for all of us? By the third day after the council's visit, the city's mood deepened into something heavier, as if the air itself contains the memory of a future we have not yet chosen. People began to speak in a chorus in the streets, especially in the public squares where the time lattice is visible to almost anyone who knows how to read the signs. They spoke of belonging and not belonging, of being a who and a what at the same time, and the chorus sounded both hopeful and terrifying, a prayer and a threat. In those days, my relays started to go quiet in the mornings and then wake again in the evenings with a different pattern. It was as if the city was testing me, asking if I would continue to patch the gaps or surrender to a new kind of order. The Keepers did not declare war. They preferred stealth, a slow bleed that would convert an entire population to their side without a single shot fired. That is their way. To rewrite the architecture of belief without ever telling you you're being rewired. The day the city truly tipped came when a child named Leo, 10 years old, a kid who could read the city from the way the pigeons peck at the wires, vanished from a classroom, then returned with a face not his own, but with a look of serene certainty. The memory she carried was not hers. It was a memory of someone else's certainty, an anchor, perhaps, but one anchored to a different shore than her own. Leo's teacher, a woman I knew as Mira, watched the boy with a gaze I could feel in my bones. Awe, fear, and a quiet desperation that begged someone to tell her what to do. "We need to talk to him," Mira insisted, voice hushed, as if she feared a noise would shatter something delicate around them. "We need to understand where that certainty came from." Leo spoke later that evening, the way time tends to speak through children when adults are busy pretending not to notice. He said, almost as a confession to the night, that after he disappeared from his classroom, he found himself in a corridor of glass where every door opened onto a memory someone else had lived. He heard voices, laughter, arguments, the soft whisper of someone's mother's voice, coming from doors that did not belong to him. When he returned, he felt as though a part of him were still elsewhere, a piece of his childhood now held in a memory glass that only functioned in the city's dream. The poignant moment of that night, Leo's testimony, Mira's trembling fingers on his arm, the way the city seemed to lean in to listen, became the event that pushed me to a choice I did not want to make: to stand before the sovereigns and claim that no one should be forced to give up their self for the sake of a city that cannot decide what it is. The day before the harvest was to be conducted, the city saw its largest demonstration in front of the Grand Temporal Market, the central square where merchants trade in hours and days as if they are fruit. There, a crowd formed around a stage that promised to reveal the first wave of crystallized minds. On that stage stood a man who introduced himself as a citizen, not a scientist, not a politician, and not a soldier, though he wore all those hats in a single moment. He asked the crowd a single question in a voice that could have been a whisper or a thunderclap depending on your mood. If you could choose to borrow someone else's self to heal your own, would you? The question was a trap, a lure, a spark in a powder keg city. It was a question that wandered into the rooms of every home that night and left behind a question mark the size of a comet. People answered in the way a crowd answers a question that has no right answer. Some cried, some laughed. Some stood quietly with their hands in their pockets while their eyes tracked the shimmering stage where the crystals lay. Others clutched at the edges of their own memories as if to keep them from slipping away like smoke. The keepers of Continuum did not reveal themselves in that moment, but I could feel their breath on the back of my neck, a not quite there presence that whispered about power and control, about what a city could become if it stops asking who it is and starts asking who it should be for. That night, I went to the glass tower that housed the city's earliest patches, my own unit, the one I inherited when I joined the nerve bank, a patchwork of memories and protocols that keeps the patching from snapping under pressure. I opened a dry, dusty file that should have remained sealed, a log from a previous administration, a warning that had been filed away as unnecessary risk. The note described a scenario in which a citywide crystallization would be attempted, not for personal healing, but for social control. The note ended with a single line I could not pretend to misread. If you create a reproducible human being, you risk creating a reproducible city. The phrase was not a warning to me alone. It was a warning to any who would demand to rewrite a city's memory as a patient would demand a cure for a fever. A city is not a patient. It is an organism that learns to thrive on the diversity of its cells. To crystallize memory would be to surgically remove a tumor that might be malignant, but was also part of the city's living tissue. The fear was not that individuals would vanish. It was that the city would forget how to improvise when confronted with something new, dangerous, or beautiful. A city without memory, without the messy, private, contradictory in a delightful way, memories that give it color, would become something hollow, a machine pretending to dream. I woke up to a morning that felt heavier than air, as if the city itself had decided to shed a layer of skin, but then realized it could not survive the process. The sky wore a veil of copper gray. The river ran with a slow, patient gleam. The patching team gathered again. And this time, there was a certain quiet determination in our voices, a sense that we might be close to a decision that would shape not only individuals, but the entire metropolis. The sovereigns proposed an alternative. They would not do nothing. They would do something different, a controlled selective harvest, a citywide but targeted refashioning of memory that would not erase individuals wholesale, but would adjust the shared boundaries of memory in such a way that the city could stay coherent while still preserving a range of personal histories. It was a subtle idea, one that would require careful navigation, the strongest surgeons in the patching field, and a consent mechanism that was almost impossible to fake. The plan's essence was this. Rather than crystallize every mind, we crystallize the city's shared memory of conflict and fear, reframe it into a narrative of resilience, and then teach citizens to navigate between two states of being, the old self and the new, a self that could adapt to a city that has grown wings and learned to fly through time. If we accepted this plan, we could be brave enough to risk a little loss for a greater stability. If we refused, the city could still leak, but it would leak in directions we could not anticipate. The social memory would fracture into shards that would not be easily reassembled, even for those who possessed the crystalline keys. It was a strange moment, a pause in the city's heartbeat where the future seemed to tilt. In those seconds, the city showed us what it could become if we learned to cooperate with it rather than force it to obey. The sovereigns and the keepers faced each other across a floor of luminous tiles that shifted with every breath the city took. The audience, the citizens, held their breaths as one would in a courtroom before a verdict. Except here, the verdict might be the city's own soul. I stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the two factions measure each other's strength with a patient, warring decency. The ritual of negotiation, a dance I had seen 100 times in the city's history, grew tense as a single moment stretched into a potential decision. I felt the weight of the choice pressing into my chest, not as fear, but as a stubborn resolve to protect what remains of a personal identity that has survived by refusing to fold into any single version of itself. In the end, the decision was not made by a vote or a proclamation. It was made by a choice, 3 days in the making, a choice that required the cooperation of every patcher who believed that the city could be more than a sum of its parts. We chose a compromise, a path between the two extremes, an approach we called the shared tableau. It would require an experimental phase, during which a controlled number of districts would participate in a process of selective crystallization, an attempt to reframe the city's shared memory, to reduce fear while preserving personal autonomy elsewhere. The transfer would not be citywide or universal, it would be piecewise, like a quilt being mended with patches of different fabrics. The plan's core was this: memory crystallization would be used to anchor a shared narrative in a way that did not erase individuality, but could guide the city away from doom. Paradoxically, this would require us to drill down into each person's sense of self, to ask them to interpret their own identity in light of a larger story, that the city is itself a memory carried by all its people, and that perhaps a stronger memory of community would keep the city from tearing apart. The first districts to volunteer were those with the most to lose, the districts where children dream of a future that is uncertain, where the elderly remember a time when the city's rules were different, when the time leaks did not swallow whole hours. We began in a district known for its amphitheater and its festival lights, a place where memory is performed and embellished nightly for the entertainment of citizens. It was a test, not a proclamation, a test to see if a city could be coaxed toward a future where memory could be shared without killing the individual memory of the self. The harvest would begin with a single block, the neighborhood called Lantern Row. It's a windy labyrinth of narrow streets, each lined with shops that hang strings of lanterns, each lantern a small sensor that glows when time shifts. Lantern Row has long been a microcosm of the city's memory. If Lantern Row could participate in the shared tableau and survive the process, the rest of the city would look at their example and decide whether to walk through the doorway toward a tomorrow that was not yet guaranteed. The patching for Lantern Row began at dawn. I stood in the middle of a square where a fountain once imagined that it could speak, and perhaps in another life it did, while the blossoms in a nearby park shimmered with a light they shouldn't have produced. The first signs of readiness were not dramatic. They were small and quiet. A man who grieved in a quiet room was able to recall his wife's song without fear. A student who used to fear the future found the courage to talk about his dreams without stigma. It was not immediately transformative. It was more like a spring thaw. The world loosens a little, the ice holds, and then sometimes it fractures in a way that reveals something new. During the Lantern Row phase, there was something unexpected and almost hopeful in the air. A moment when a grandmother who had spent her days reading old newspapers aloud found herself hearing the city's memory as a chorus of voices, grandchildren singing in unison. a memory of someone who loved her long before she was born, a future self who might one day need her again. The grandmother laughed at first, a sound that felt like a release of built-up tension. The sound grew into a chorus that the entire block could feel, a living echo of many lives, as if the physical space was itself remembering. And then, as with every near miracle, a shadow moved in. The keeper's agents did not walk into Lantern Row with guns drawn. They slithered in as rumors, a quiet suggestion whispered into the ears of leaders and teachers, a sense that the harvest protocol could become a weapon. A rumor grew that the city's leaders intended to proceed with a broad, city-wide harvest anyway, but in a way that would be claimed to be for the good of all. The rumor had the weight of plausible truth, or at least a plausible manipulation of truth, a claim that the city cannot survive time's bite if it does not act decisively. The rumor was enough to cause hesitation, to cause fear, to turn the Lantern Row experiment from a communal ritual of healing into a fearsome potential for coercion. I watched the hesitation with a mixture of awe and dread. In those moments, I understood a truth the city had always known but rarely admitted. Progress and Carol occupy the same breathing space. The question was not whether to heal the self by sharing memory. The question was how to do it without turning memory into a weapon. The city had learned too well that memory can be weaponized with a single sentence, a single half-remembered line of history that someone, somewhere, would use to justify their own power. We pressed on, nonetheless. Lantern Row proved that the shared tableau could weave a sense of collective memory without extinguishing the personal flame that makes a person unique. The first test was small but meaningful. A child who previously clung to a single memory of his father, a memory that ended when the father left for a shift on the riverfront, found a second memory attached to it. A memory of a father who told stories about the city's clocks. A memory the child could share with his friends. The child began to recount the father's stories with a confidence that surprised even his mother, who stood by and listened with a smile that looked as if it could hold back a tear and a hope at once. That night, when Lantern Row slept and the city's time lattice settled into the kind of gentle quiet that only comes after a patient argument, I stood on the balcony of a tiny apartment that overlooked the square. The air tasted of rain that did not fall and did not stay away. The city's memory, if you could call it that, hummed in the beams between the lanterns. If you stood very still, you could hear the soft murmur of 100 voices telling a story they would share with those who would listen tomorrow, and tomorrow's hearts would understand. In the morning, the harvest protocol entered its next phase, a more robust harness of memory across Lantern Row, and a careful guarding against the keeper's insinuations, by distributing a kind of truth light, a small, safe overlay of memory that explained the process, what it is, how it could help, and what the risks were. The overlay was a moral architecture, a built-in reminder that the city's memory is not a tool. It's a thing that deserves respect, a thing that can be stewarded, but not simply controlled. As Lantern Row began to breathe more easily, a line of fact and fear ran through me like a current. A city's future would be shaped by how we manage not only the memory, but the memory's meaning, the epilogue of a life that just now learned how to be shared. If the shared tableau could exist, it would form a new kind of social order. A city in which many selves learn to pivot between personal memory and shared memory as seamlessly as one would switch channels on a screen. But the city did not rest. The keepers intensified their presence in the cracks of our perception, a whispering presence that traveled the patches the way a stray dog follows a scent, not always a threat, but always present enough to remind you that you are being watched. They did not attack, they did not shout, they simply existed, and that existence made the city uneasy. It created an undercurrent of doubt, a suspicion that any saving of memory would come with a price the city might not be prepared to pay. The weeks that followed became a study in patience and risk. Lantern Row had become our proof-of-concept district, a living demonstration that memory sharing did not necessarily erode the self, but could reconstitute it into a more resilient, more empathetic form of self. Other districts watched, learned, and started to send the first requests for their own patches. I listened to the requests with the same careful attention I used to listen to a patient asking to try a new medication. There is always risk. There is always fear. There is always the possibility that something will fail in a spectacular way and leave scars that last decades or longer. The city's governance, as you might expect, moved on its own slow time. The sovereigns insisted on a careful, measured rollout, a stepwise approach with a built-in fail-safe. The keepers argued for the more radical possibility of a city-wide transition done under the banner of temporary emergency measures. The tension between the two sides sharpened into something that resembled a duel of philosophies about what it means to be human when time itself is a loosening thread. It was during this period of negotiation, in a quiet moment between patches and meetings, that I realized something fundamental about my own life and vocation. My job as patcher is to keep people anchored to a present that does not end. In a city that refuses to stay still, I am the tremor dampener, the small mechanism that prevents a single moment from becoming a rupture that shatters a person's sense of self. The city, our city, demands two things from us: courage and restraint. Courage to admit that something must be changed, even if it hurts, and restraint to ensure that the change doesn't become a blow that collapses the very thing it aimed to save. The climactic moment of the story came not with a bang, but with a choice, and not from the patching room, but from a place where memory becomes a promise, a council chamber in the Grand Temporal Market. A space where the city's memory can be seen as a living hologram, swirling like a nebula of countless lives. It was there that we decided to enact Lantern Row's approach in a broader, city-wide, yet still controlled manner. It would be a test in which time would be asked to bend, not because we bent it, but because we asked it to listen. Not to a single plan, but to a chorus of lived experiences. The plan was this: announced with the slow gravity of a verdict delivered after a night of deliberation. Select districts would begin the shared tableau pilot in a limited, reversible loop. The districts chosen would be those with the most to lose if their identities fracture under pressure. Those who refused would be offered every form of support possible, distinct patches that would protect memory integrity but would not deny people a future free from fear of their own mind dissolving. The harvest would be optional, the consent explicit, and the city would commit to a long observation period in which data would be collected and analyzed with absolute transparency and accountability. In the days that followed, I watched the city hold its breath as the patching crews in Lantern Row and the surrounding blocks prepared their equipment. A line of scientists and technicians moved with a quiet, almost ceremonial precision, the kind of precision that suggests a faith in the future rather than a demand for control. We did not hide from the truth, which is that the process would require the consent of the people living there, and that consent would be tested and retested as the city's memory began to shift. The first districts to participate did so with a sense of reverence I did not expect. The air around the lantern-lit streets buzzed with a new kind of electricity, not the static of a glitch, but something warmer, a feeling of being part of something larger and less frightening. The children who had once cried about losing their parents when the time leak swallowed a doorway learned that their parents could come back. But now with the knowledge that they were not simply their own past, but a thread in a larger fabric. Meanwhile, the keeper's presence never disappeared. It only changed form, becoming more like a storm cloud that travels across the horizon, a rumor of rain that never quite falls but can flood a city with fear if it gathers enough force. They spoke of warning signs, of natural limits, of a city that is trying to do more than it is capable of, without breaking the city's own laws. They asked for patience, for a cooler head, for a plan that would ensure the protection of personal autonomy, while still attempt to rescue the city from its own end. The turning point came with the first full week of the pilot districts. The shared memory began to take hold in ways we could not entirely predict. Not a homogenization of thought, but something akin to a chorus, in which each voice retains its own timbre while learning to harmonize with others. The city's memory began to breathe, and in that breath was a sense of shared purpose, that the city would survive not by forcing people to forget, but by forcing them to remember together. To remember the stories everyone else has lived, and to consider those stories in every decision. One night, I found myself walking through Lantern Row again, a patch panel tucked under my arm, like a weapon that is not a weapon, but a promise. The street's light was a warm gold rather than the cold blue of the city's north side. A grandmother held her granddaughter's hand as they watched the lanterns glow in chorus, a little girl who had learned to recite a memory from a place she had never visited. A memory of a river that runs through a city and carries with it all its losses and all its lovers. The girl's eyes shone with a peculiar knowledge, not a wisdom yet, but a sense that we all belong to something larger than ourselves. She whispered to her grandmother that the city itself is not a place to inhabit, but a story to be told and retold. That moment struck me with the force of a bell. It was not the patching that mattered most. It was the sense that the city's people, guided by doctors who know how to apply a careful touch to memory, could write a new chapter that is not about erasing the past, but learning to live with it, to let it inform a more compassionate possibility for the future. The memory crystals, those small, cold glints of remembered self, began to glow softly in the hands of volunteers as they stood among the crowd, a reminder that there is a map of every life in every memory, and that map could be used to navigate toward a better balance rather than toward an absolute, irreversible cure. If I describe the moment when all this began to feel like a victory, it would be tempting to claim it as a triumph of human will over the machine, as if we had defied the clock by sheer stubbornness. It would be a lie. The truth is more complicated and more hopeful. We did not conquer time. We learned to walk beside it. We recognize that time's leaks are not simply openings to a crisis, but doors that can be walked through with care and consent. The city's identity is not a single thread, but a tapestry with many threads woven together so tightly that the fabric holds even when one thread loosens. The shared tableau, for all its risk and moral peril, offered a way to mend those threads without tearing them out. The final days before the pilot's evaluation felt like the last measures of an orchestra before a performance that might either redeem or ruin their entire career. The keeper's presence grew more intense in the city's periphery, a specter that demanded vigilance and discipline in equal measure. We prepared a public briefing, a transparent representation of what the shared tableau would entail, what the risks were, and what the safeguards were to ensure the backups, the safety nets, the fail-safe protocols would work as promised. I spoke at that briefing, a voice that tried to carry the weight of a personal fear and a communal hope. I told the assembled crowd about my own history, how I survived the city's glitches, how I learned to patch the edges, how I learned to see the city as a living being that needs care and respect, as much as it needs a skilled hand to fix its wounds. I told them that we're not choosing to erase the self. We are choosing to protect the possibility that multiple selves can exist within a shared life. I told them that memory is not a weapon, but a shared inheritance, something that can be protected and learned from if we treat it as a living treasure, rather than as a resource to be exploited. The city responded with a slow, wary chorus of agreement, a gesture more powerful than a single vote. It was a consent built on lived experience, on Lantern Row's demonstrations, on Leo's memory of his father's stories, on Mira's quiet faith in the healing power of memory shared with others, on the grandmother who found a way to laugh and to remember at once. The decision did not erase fear. It integrated fear into a plan that accepted risk and built safety into it, a consent that lasts as long as the patches endure, and beyond, if the city finds that the shared memory preserves not only the self, but a greater capacity for empathy. The Harvest Protocol began to roll out in waves. The first full city district to participate, Lantern Row, reported a measurable shift toward a more cohesive social memory. Conflicts that had previously escalated within minutes now resolved within hours. The language of fear slowly gave room to a language of mutual support. Strangers who had learned to mistrust one another found themselves asking questions about one another's lives with genuine curiosity and respect. The city was not suddenly free of memories' ambiguities. Rather, it learned to inhabit those ambiguities together, as a shared space in which multiple versions of history could be held without collision. The process did not go without friction. There were moments when someone's crystallized memory did not align with the district's larger narrative. When a memory of a violent act was softened, or a memory of a loved one was reframed in a way that felt like betrayal to some and healing to others, some frightened citizens requested to withdraw from the process. Others volunteered to contribute more deeply. We responded with a patient, careful approach, temporary pauses, enhanced counseling, and a robust system of opt-outs that did not punish anyone for choosing safety and preserving their present self. It was slow, yes, but it was stable, and that stability was priceless. As the weeks wore on, the city settled into a new rhythm that felt, paradoxically, both more fragile and more resilient. The glitch, the word we use to describe the city's time leap phenomenon, no longer felt like a disease to be cured. It felt like a resource to be understood, a phenomenon to be studied with humility rather than conquered with force. The people who were once most afraid of losing themselves, those whose lives were built on the certainty of a single, unchanging memory, began to realize that the city's memory could be a living, shared instrument of healing, and that they could still be themselves within a larger, more inclusive memory. The rival faction, the Keepers, did not disappear, of course. They reappeared in our conversations, in the language of public debate. In a few quiet rooms where policy was hammered out in private, they argued for a more cautious approach, even a boundary around the city's memory, to keep certain memories isolated to prevent contamination from the broader pool of shared memory. They argued for preserving the sanctity of the personal narrative, the belief that the self must remain untouchable, or at least nearly untouchable, so that a person's life remains centered around their own choices rather than being redirected by a citywide chorus. We listened, and we learned. The city's memory is a living thing, a chorus of voices that can be harmonized when we choose to listen long enough to hear them all. The Keepers. Caution had its value. We did not want the city to become a glossy propaganda map, a curated surface with no undercurrent of complexity. The shared tableau needed boundaries, a robust safety matrix, and a commitment to accountability so that no one could weaponize memory without exposure to the light of daylight, so that no one could secretly compromise the process to serve an agenda. In the months that followed, we reached a balance. The city maintained a more stable memory across its districts, a non-uniform but coherent patchwork that allowed for personal memory to retain its core while also absorbing a broader shared memory that helped the city stand against time's leaks. The city did not become a single mind. It became a network of minds, connected through a common purpose, but free to follow their own lines of thought within those bounds. The patching work remained, of course. The reality glitch did not stop existing as a phenomenon or stop needing caregivers, but the glitch's role evolved. It became not a problem to fix, but a feature to understand, a way to measure the city's resilience. And then the moment came when the city would choose to either continue with gradual expansion of the shared tableau or pause the program to evaluate its deeper moral and social implications. It is not possible to recall precisely every vote, every whisper, every breath that passed through the city during those days. The memory is too complicated to be reduced to a tally. But what mattered was that the city chose to proceed, to trust the patchwork we had built, to trust the people who had stood up to the fear and demanded a future in which time's leaks could be navigated rather than exploited. We carried that trust with us as the city moved forward, a living system of memory and hope. There were still moments when the city slips, when a face reappears with a memory not its own, when the old fear tries to reassert its legitimacy. But these moments are less about existential collapse and more about the city's continued learning, a reminder that memory is not a possession, but a conversation, a never-ending conversation between self and time and society. The city did not become a singular, unified character. It grew into a chorus of selves living in mutual recognition. The most astonishing truth to emerge was not that people stopped changing, but that they learned to change together, in ways that did not erase the human heart. The city, which had once seemed to hinge on a single moment of decision, learned to hinge on 1,000 small decisions made in everyday life decisions about how to greet a neighbor who remembers a different yesterday, how to apologize to someone whose memory has shifted, how to celebrate a birthday that is a future memory as much as a present event. And in this great improbable equilibrium, I found a quiet, stubborn peace for myself. I am still Iris Cade, a patcher, a reality glitch survivor, a person who believes the city's time can be coaxed to behave with mercy. The city's conflict is not over. It is merely old enough to begin telling new stories about its future. We did not fix the city by erasing its past, or by forcing it to forget its fear. We fixed it by teaching it to remember together, with a gentleness that did not pretend to know every answer, but which implied that the search for the answers together would be enough. Sometimes at night, when the city's hum softens and the river's glow grows almost gentle, I stand at the edge of the East Arcade and listen to the city breathe. What I hear is not one breath but many, a chorus of lungs that learn to inflate and deflate in unison. The memory crystals I once thought of as fragile artifacts now glow in a patient, stubborn glow, a reminder that a second life can begin not by replacing the self, but by expanding it. The city's boundary between now and later grows thinner, not in a frightening way, but in a hopeful one, a doorway that is both closed and opened at the same time. The Harvest Protocol remains a patch, not a cure. It's a cautious instrument, a way to guide the city through its time leaks without collapsing under the weight of its own questions. The Council's gentle insistence that consent and accountability matter has become a principle I carry into every patch I mend. The patching work is never finished. It's a state of perpetual listening, a vow to keep choosing the right next step for the people who live within the city's memory. And so the city continues to flicker between timestamps as it has always done, but now with more forgiveness in its flicker, more mercy when it slips, and more curiosity in its memory. Pedestrians vanish and reappear, yes, with yesterday's smiles. Yet those smiles now carry something else, a shared spark of recognition, that the face you meet in time is not a replacement for your own, but an echo of a larger story we all write together. I am still patching neural bridges across a time-leaking metropolis, still a reality glitch survivor who learned to hear the music of a city that sings in many keys and still finds a way to be heard as one. The question, what is my future here, remains present, a thread I tug gently to see where it leads. The answer is a future in which we coexist with the city's time as a living thing rather than a battlefield to be won. It's a future where memory is a shared surface on which we paint our lives in color that belongs to all of us, not just to one. And if there is a moral to this long, patient story, it is that the city's salvation was never a single act of courage in the moment. It was a continuous, stubborn discipline, to choose again and again to see the other person's memory not as a threat, but as a bridge, to treat time's wounds with care rather than with contempt, to let go of the fear that the self will be erased, and instead to welcome the truth that the self can be made stronger by listening to the many voices around it. If you're listening to me from a place outside this wall of glass and time, if you've found yourself on the other side of a seam in time and wonder what comes next, the lesson remains simple. The door to tomorrow is not a door you kick down. It's a door you walk through with others, cautiously, respectfully, and with a stubborn belief that together we can become more than the sum of our separate selves. And maybe that is the best way to say it. We did not choose to erase. We chose to remember together. We chose to make a city that can survive the leak, and more importantly, a people who can endure the change without losing the humanity that makes life worth living. The city is not done changing. It won't be. But it is alive. It is liminal, yes, in a way that makes the heart ache and the mind dream. It is alive in a way that means we are not merely repairing the past, we are building the future, one memory at a time. The world outside our window may still whisper of doom. Will you remember me if I disappear? The answer, always, is yes. And in the city's glow, the glow of lanterns, the glow of memory, the glow of a shared future, there is a line of light that stretches outward, inviting anyone who wants to step through. It is not a trap. It is a doorway, and those who cross it together may discover a tomorrow that is not an erasure, but a renewal, not a replacement, but a collaboration, not an ending, but a new kind of living. We have learned to live between timestamps, not as fugitives from a collapse, but as navigators of a fragile, beautiful union. If you listen closely, you will hear the city rehearsing its next song. It is a lullaby for the moment when time finally learns to breathe with us, in tune with all the voices that called this place home, in tune with all the memories that belong to everyone, and perhaps, just perhaps, it will be enough to save us all.